So if you look at most large-scale operating platforms in healthcare, they're getting AI scribes to claim they have a better workplace for the therapist so that they have less notes at home, claim the therapist can see more patients, but none of them are talking about the very thing that it's meant to do. Bring humanity back to healthcare and allow them to be fully present and be more effective to produce better outcomes. That's the real difference.
All right. Everybody wants to talk about AI, or maybe they don't want to talk about it, but they sure are talking about it. And the questions come up. Will it replace clinicians? Will it write our notes? Yes. Will it make healthcare more efficient? Remains to be seen. Larry's latest article asks a completely different question. What if AI isn't here to replace clinicians? What if it's here to give them back the part of the job they fell in love with in the first place? So Larry, let's start there. Why do you think everybody's asking the wrong question? Because you open and you say, 40 years ago, I took an oath to care for people. You started with an oath 40 years ago, not with AI. Why did you start with that oath from long ago?
Yeah, I think it's because the conversation about AI has already, gone backwards. And I wanted to reset and, level set around why we got into this profession. Everyone is now entering it asking what the technology can do. I wanted to start with what I promised to do as a caregiver 40 years ago, to a patient as a caregiver, not to a vendor. And so the oath sort of frames the tool, not the other way around. If you start with AI, you're already conceded the argument to the people selling it. I'm just not interested in that conversation for the purposes of call to care. I'm interested in what we owe the person on the table, the patient. So the oath is the standard, the code of ethics, the whole professional reasons why we got in here. AI either measures up to it or doesn't.
All right. So one of the strongest lines in the article, I thought anyway, was the only question worth asking is whether we have the discipline to use this tool for the one thing it's actually good for, giving the human being back to the patient. What do you mean by giving the human being back? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so if you think historically, as your time as a PT and healthcare provider, what we've really been robbed is with time with patients, particularly in physical therapy where everything has been, remediated or gone down to a billable unit. It's all about documentation, pre-authorization, productivity mandates, the 9-minute, the 8-minute rule, not 12-minute visit windows. Every one of those looks like another minute of attention redirected at a screen. So giving the human being back means reversing that theft. Eyes on the patient, listening for the thing that the chart can never capture, noticing what the patient isn't saying, the verbal and the nonverbal. That encounter, fully present, undistracted, is what got engineered out of workflow and maximizing productivity and efficiency. We need to engineer it back in. And that's the whole argument. Everything else is footnotes. I started writing an article and Tim Flynn was helping me with it. And I think I actually sent it to you to review a bit. And it's about the 5 agents. Everything in AI now is about agentic movement and moving to agents. So I love that. And I've identified what I believe are 5 agents that can help us in physical therapy, because at the end of the day, they bring humanness back to healthcare. And the one we're going to talk about in this article, or the one we did talk about in this article, and it'll transgress a little bit also while I'm reintroducing call to care, is about the whole idea of bringing the human back and using AI scribe for the documentation pieces. But don't get me wrong, scribes and agents can do many other things. They can do pre-cert. They can do outcomes. They can give us feedback loops and a daily report of how we conducted. They can listen to our notes and give us constructive criticism on how we better have verbal and nonverbal skills. So I'm all for AI, but I believe its function is really around humanity. and allowing us to be fully human and present for our patients as opposed to be fully engaged in a technology.
So let's bring some humanity into it. You brought someone into this particular article. You named her Sarah. You said, here, painted a picture. She's not a bad clinician. She's been around for about 12 years. She's not burned out because she stopped caring. She's burned out because the system slowly pulled her away from the work she loved. And I think a lot of people will say, well, these kids today, it's very easy to fall into it. These kids today don't. But when you look at it that way, because she's burned out because the system pulled her away from the things she loved, how common do you think a Sarah is?
Well, I've known 100 of them. I've employed probably hundreds of them in the last 40 years. When your burnout rate runs from 45 to 71% just on PTs, and I cite in the article dentists and dental hygienists and others. And when you have in 1 year, arguably 15,000 PTs walking out the door, she's not the outlier. She's the norm. And we have to recall the data, which shows that on a full-time equivalent basis, only 25% of all physical therapists that are licensed are actually practicing clinically.
Wow.
But what makes Sarah's story so worth telling is that she's a great clinician. Her outcomes are strong. Her patients, like her colleagues respect her, and she's counting the years until she can afford to leave. And that's the tell. It's not the weak clinician burning out. It's the good ones, the ones who came in with passion and skill at the system, the ones who worked hard in school to even get accepted in PT school. Now, they didn't lose their ability. They left their sense of calling. They lost their meaningful, purposeful work. And once that goes, the clock is running. It's just a function until they're looking to get into a non-clinical position.
I feel like one of the distinctions that you made is two sides to a coin. And people go back and forth and they argue over it. That burnout isn't this personal failure. It's a system that stopped replenishing its people, what I just said a minute ago. Why is that distinction so important to focus on where that fault actually is or where the solution could be?
Yeah, it's like anything else. Once you have the diagnosis, then you could determine the prescription, right? And I would also argue the system includes our education system, because we know statistically that by the time new PTs land in our clinic for their first full-time job, a good portion of them are already burned out. Now, we can argue about the term burnout. There's some medical things around it. I've written pretty extensively about it. But let's forget about the word for a minute and just think of it as people leaving the profession or being disengaged. And when you're disengaged and working with patients, you're less likely to have, very good outcomes. If it's a personal failure, then the fix would be resilience, wellness, a lot of those kinds of things. But we've been running that experiment now for a long time. Burnout has actually gotten worse. Even though there's been a more sensitivity to it, it's actually gotten worse. So the intervention is failed because it's treated the wrong problem. When you name it as a system failure, you're forced to redesign the system. That's much harder conversation to have, and the one and no one in leadership really wants to talk about because it lands accountability where it belongs. The operators, and again, it's all back to operation. The people who built the workflows that the very clinicians we're trying to keep. So that's the distinction. It's not a semantic description, Jimmy. It's really what determines whether anything actually can change or happen to improve this.
Let's talk about AI scribes. I feel like everybody markets them. When you see an ad for them, if you get on a call with someone who's wanted to talk about them, they lead with efficiency. That's their sell. It's an efficiency tool. And then they'll hit you with a statistic, usually in time or money saved. You argue that's almost missing the point. Where are they missing the point on this?
Yeah, so let's just level set here a bit. It took us a long time to get adoption to EMR, especially in physical therapy. The good news, I think, is that there's been reasonable adoption and quick adoption by AI scribes in PT and in healthcare in general. I would put dentistry a little bit behind in that regards. But why has that been the push? The push is because we want to make the system more efficient. And efficiency is the wrong goal. If you deploy a scribe and tell the therapist that the point is that you can now see more patients per day, you've simply designed a tool, you've designed a tool to restore humanity to work and used it to accelerate the very thing and the very reason why Sarah is burning out. You haven't solved the problem. You've automated it while leaving everything else intact. And that's sort of in the article I talk about Dr. Blaine's calcification with a software, upgrade. And the other thing is, if the win is, oh, we're doing this for our therapists, this is how much we care, and this is why we want to attract more PTs because we have such shortages, because you'll be able to, by using AI Scribe, you'll have less time on notes, in the office, so more time at home. And, that's real, and that's a quality of life improvement, but that's just optimizing Sarah's evenings. I'm not interested in what happens to the patient. They're not interested in what happened to the patient in the room. The scribe's purpose is simply to make Sarah faster by that, unprofessional management business speak.
Right.
That's not the purpose. The purpose is to make her fully present for the patient. Those are very different goals with very different outcomes. If it's efficiency, it's going to lack effectiveness. If it's effectiveness, it's going to begot effectiveness. Management keeps confusing them, and the patients pay for it. So if you look at most large-scale operating platforms in healthcare, they're getting AI scribes to claim they have a better workplace for the therapist so that they have less notes at home, claim the therapist can see more patients, but none of them are talking about the very thing that it's meant to do: bring humanity back to healthcare and allow them to be fully present and be more effective to produce better outcomes. That's the real difference.
The first time I took a look at an AI scribe a year and a half, 2 years ago, I, of course, default to like an advertising campaign. And I said, this might bring eye contact back. And as simple as that is, that felt more humane than the 28 minutes, per note saved. That felt better. You talk about a cockpit analogy instead of automation, where the autopilot does the mundane. It maps, it flies, it goes up and down, but the human comes in at different points. Why is automation the wrong mental model for healthcare? Because behind AI, automation has got to be the next most used word recently.
Yeah, it is. And it's the wrong word again, because automation implies replacement. On a factory line, a machine removes the human. In a clinic, that collapses on contact with reality, right? A therapist can't hand clinical judgment to a probabilistic system. It can't automate that out of it. No patient ever got better because a model was confident, right? So the cockpit is the right mental model because the roles stay very, very clear. The autopilot flies the plane, altitude, course, systems. The pilot commands it. It takes over at takeoff, landing. The pilot takes over at landing, at takeoff. In the instant something unexpected happens, nobody says the autopilot replaced the pilot. His or her interventions are fewer, better leveraged, and at higher stakes. It allows them to be more present for when the other problems that can happen. And so that's the architecture for healthcare AI that I really, really like. It allows the therapist to be on autopilot. The system manages the workflow. The clinician manages the decision. It manages the human interactions. This idea of very much every time we have high technology, we have to have high touch. And so automation allows the therapist to be on autopilot, to be more hands-on and more high touch. The minute you call it automation, you've already, really started to design the wrong outcome, in my opinion.
One phrase that stuck out was, and this feels like it could be on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt or an ad campaign, was AI drafts, clinicians decide. Why is that line in the sand so important for healthcare leaders designing or implementing these AI systems?
So, because generating a note is the easy 90%. The question that earns trust is how you confirm that it's true. A clinician who reviews what the model produced and signs it isn't a rubber stamp. She's an accountable professional exercising judgment. A clinician who signs without reviewing is ratifying, not verifying, right? And the liability sits with the clinician either way from a legal standpoint. So AI drafts, clinicians decide isn't a slogan, it's a design principle. It forces accountability into the workflow rather than bolting it on after the fact. Any system that doesn't build verification as the product, not generation, is a malpractice machine, dressed up with efficiency software, right? I won't work with one, and I won't recommend working with one. I mean, that's just the key. You have to really let clinicians be clinicians, and not defer to AI. There's a great saying, and it's absolutely true, and I've said it, and that is that AI doesn't have a bad day. Well, that's exactly right, but clinicians do. And when clinicians have a bad day, their notes aren't going to all of a sudden reflect a good day. And so you need verification, and you need the therapist to actively engage.
All right. If a healthcare CEO and operator called you tomorrow and said, "Hey, we're investing heavily in AI," what's the one question you'd ask to have them reveal whether or not they're building something that restores humanity or just another productivity tool?
Yeah, I would say, are you measuring your AI scribe and your investment in AI by the patient FaceTime with the therapist, or by how efficient or throughput or how many visits per day? You're not seeing board decks with patient FaceTime and outcomes. You're seeing board decks with visits per day efficiency. Right. And, oh yeah, we're a better workplace because our therapists don't have to do work at home. And so therefore we're trying to solve, retention and turnover. How about changing the narrative a little bit and using AI to help therapists produce better outcomes and more effective time with their patients, as opposed to the efficiency trap? If an operator gives me a productivity number on how much AI helped their productivity, the patients per day, the visits per hour, or notes completed faster, they're using AI to accelerate the very, very problem that was burning people out. In fact, I wrote, even a couple of years ago in the Substack about how my initial fear around AI was that it was going to be used as the tool to see more patients per day or be more productive. I didn't realize how prescient that was, because that's exactly what's happened. You're not hearing about how more effective a therapist is, because people aren't getting the heart of the burnout program. They're trying to control the symptoms through efficiency.
The money question here, and we've heard this before on pitches or in ad campaigns. If AI gives every clinician an extra 30 minutes a day, what's the worst thing a leader could do with those 30 minutes that has been given back?
Yeah, the worst thing they can do is tell the therapist that they have to see more patients, that they have to do more compliance review, that they have to do more documentation, that they have to get online and pass their HIPAA course for the year. Allow the therapist some time to reflect, to think about their patient care, to mentor, to free them up to do clinical work. The thing that drives people to become a PT was you want to do clinical work. Nobody ever became a physical therapist because they wanted to be an expert in documentation, to be a compliance. They didn't know the 8-minute rule existed. All of those kind of things. I almost think we ought to make therapists sign prenuptial agreements when they get into the profession their first day, right? And really expose them to the negatives around all of these kind of things. These distractors are going to put them in a period where they're going to really be there. It's almost like that could be used as part of a burnout prevention program.
All right. If the conversation about AI usually starts with one question, what can a technology do? Allow Larry to help you think it should start somewhere else. What should the technology give back? Because if AI only makes clinicians faster, I feel like you think we missed the point. If it gives them back their attention, presence, humanity, then maybe technology becomes the thing that helps us care again. If today's conversation challenged the way you think and made you a little uncomfortable, good. That's the point. Subscribe to The Operator on Substack. And this is part one of a series called Call to Care in the Age of AI series, which will lead into a re-release of some literature as well. You want to front tease that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Call to Care was a book I wrote in 2020, giving humanity healthcare back to, and it's really how we can take positive psychology and the social science, social neuroscience, and understand that the soft skills in healthcare are the hard skills, and those are the ones that make a huge difference on patient outcomes. And so you'll see it's expanded with some additional chapters on AI, of all things, and virtual health, which didn't exist even in 2020. along with some new psychological principles that have been, stood the test of time from an intervention standpoint, including implementation intentions, some additional things on mindfulness, how to be mindful without feeling like you always have to meditate, and some other areas that I think people will chant. So at the end of the day, the book's got about 25% expanded and updated on material. So very excited about it.
All right, more to come with that. Until next time, keep operating.
Absolutely.